All right, AP World, the onslaught continues. For this section of notes, we'll have a little bit of a split because in sixth period we got a little bit further on these notes than we did in seventh period, sorry. And so those of you that are in sixth period, you should be able to forward past a slide or so, and then you can pick up with us from there. All right, but for those of you that are in seventh period, let's go ahead and take care of some of this business right here. All right, so we're talking about those indigenous responses and resistance to imperialism. And so we've kind of been to India, we've been to the Americas, we've been to the Balkans, and we had finished off with taking a look at Vietnam. Taking a look at some examples of this in Asia. And so the Philippines will just kind of lump right in there with that. Jose Rizal that you see there is was a Filipino who was basically a reform leader. Philippines was under Spanish control as we're in the 19th century, one of the few parts of the old Spanish Empire that they've been able to hang on to. But you do have Filipinos that are pushing back. Rizal is an example of someone who's pushing back very gently. He helps to form what's called the Liga Filipina, which is the Philippine League. And he's pretty loyal to the Spanish, but this league is suggesting it's not like some kind of militant group that starts bombing things, but they suggest a future that would include Philippine independence. For his efforts, the Spanish arrest Rizal and execute him, and then that's going to help eventually to trigger pretty much a full-out revolt by the Filipino people against the Spanish. And that revolution starts in 1890s, 1896 in particular. And just a couple of years after that is when the Spanish-American War breaks out, when the United States declares war on Spain, kind of centered mainly in a lot of the fighting in the Caribbean, but then it spreads out to the Philippines as well, and the United States attacks the Philippines, the Spanish colony there, with the idea of depending on your perspective, freeing the Filipino people or establishing a U.S. presence in the Pacific. I'll let you decide there. And let me get some more of this here. And that, the Spanish-American War is successful from the American perspective. They defeat Spain. It's where we pick up our possessions in the Caribbean, like Cuba and Puerto Rico. But the United States is able to force Spain out with the Spanish-American War. The Filipinos celebrated that Spanish defeat because they believed that meant independence. It didn't take too long for them to figure out that the Americans who had come in to push the Spanish out suddenly showed no sign of leaving themselves. And the United States pretty much established control over the Philippines, and the Filipinos rose up against the United States, go from fighting Spain to the U.S. It's a very ugly kind of a guerrilla war that takes place in kind of the forests and jungles of the Philippines, and it kind of catches the United States off guard. We definitely have the technological advantages over the Filipinos, but they know the land, and fighting in the jungles. Some historians actually draw some parallels between this and what happens later on in Vietnam. Anyhow, we are able to eventually, in 1902, defeat the Filipinos, and the United States will maintain control over the Philippines until after World War II, and then the United States will grant the Philippines their independence, but that's further on down the road. All right, the story of Australia and their indigenous people called the Aborigines. These are people who had been living in Australia since the beginning of time. I mean, matter of fact, they have, still to this day, they have the credit of being referred to as the oldest continuous culture on Earth of pretty much any population on Earth. when the British show up to establish their penal colony in Australia, they see these indigenous people as more or less in their way. They refuse to grant them citizenship, and because they're not citizens, they can't own land. So the British don't recognize their, basically their land claims that go back, forever, and start pushing them out to make room for British settlers, and who are coming in. I should say British. A lot of Irish end up in Australia as well. Again, many of them going there to work off their prison sentence, and then being able to establish themselves with colonies afterwards. The Aborigines will resist against the British, but it'll be a pretty futile resistance, as the British are able to use technological advantages in terms of military hardware against a fairly primitive Aboriginal enemy, and the Aborigines will end up losing most of their land and basically under the heel of the British. All right, and then really quickly in New Zealand, because we talked about this actually in our last unit, if you recall, the Haka, and that is the Maori Wars that go on in New Zealand when the British go in and find the Maori people there, who had Polynesians who had settled in New Zealand. Some war that goes back and forth there, but by the turn of the 20th century, the Maori have lost most of their territory to the British, and the British have pretty much firm control over the island. All right. Taking a look at some examples of resistance in the African continent. We'll start you off with the Sokoto Caliphate against the British. The Caliphate, and hopefully that word is a trigger for us. That means that they were Muslims, and so this is one of our parts of Africa that had fallen under that influence when all those Muslim traders back in the good old trans-Saharan days had established their links and their influence. As far as the Sokoto go, where they end up coming up against the British this is in the early 19th century, 1804, and the Sokoto Caliphate are trying to maintain the slave trade, attacking other African nations and kingdoms around them, and using those prisoners, like we talked about in units prior, to supply slaves for the slave trade. The only difference being by 1804, you have more and more countries that are outlawing the international slave trade, including the British. And so the British step in, actually, not originally to take any land or anything, but actually to end the Sokoto Caliphate's involvement in the slave trade. Series of wars ensue from that, and by the early 20th century, the British will have control over their territory, which is mostly in West Africa. I guess I should say, to be specific there, West Africa. Down in South Africa, you are going to have, we can talk about a few of them here that in South Africa. The first one is the Xhosa cattle killing movement. The Xhosa people had their land claims down in the southern part, south part of Africa, South Africa itself, I guess I should just say. And when the British, and remember South Africa, they see some outside interference from the Dutch and the British. Specifically, when the British start moving into Xhosa territory, they start to notice, the Xhosa people do, that as the British start coming in, they are also bringing their own cattle with them and establishing their own kind of little farms and kind of ranches in the area. And pretty soon, a lot of the Xhosa's cattle are starting to get sick and dying. We kind of conjecture nowadays that they may have been acquiring diseases from the British cows, and it was spreading to their herds. Well, you want to put herbs on that. Never mind. And what the Xhosa people do in response to this. If I recall the story correctly, kind of their religious leaders are kind of guiding them on this, is that they believe that if they kill all of their cattle, I mean, they have some of them dying from disease, they believe that if they kill them all, that will pretty much make the British go away. And some of that gets into kind of, they'll kill them all, and the spirits will of the dead cattle will make the British all kind of run away. And it doesn't work too well. Okay, don't try doing anything like that yourself. It just what it does is it triggers a famine among the Xhosa people, and really just makes it all the more easier in the end for the British to come in and colonize them. All right, yeah, a sad little story there, and kind of an illustration of sometimes in desperation. Some of the things that indigenous people would do. It kind of reminds me of the ghost dance religion here in North America, when tribes like the Sioux began to, in the last days of the Indian Wars, they adopted these ghost shirts that they wore that they believed would make them bulletproof, and they believed that the ghost dance would bring back to life all the dead Native Americans who had died fighting against American settlers coming in, and that they all together would clear the West and it'd go back to the good old days. And it's those things that come out of just desperation and failing hope. And the Xhosa cattle killing movement is an example of that. The Zulu Wars, also in South Africa, another example here of the British coming in. The Zulus had fought some wars with the Dutch before, and initially when the British come in to establish dominance over that territory and expand their colonial holdings, the Zulu kind of make them earn it. They defeat the British in one major battle, but then the British overwhelmed them with more numbers, and again bringing in that technology of the late 19th century. And in the end, the Zulu end up losing their territory as well, as the British just spread more and more of their control over the southern part of Africa. All right. Samory Toure, that story there is back to West Africa. And here's where the French are in, also trying to establish some of their other colonies. And this is I guess would be what ends up being Guinea in West Africa. And again, just another example of Toure is trying to create his own new kingdom. The French see it as a threat, and so step right in and bring in their military. And by the time it's over, Guinea is under French control. Just kind of a repeat of this. Well, it is, a lot of it is the same. The modest revolt. This is, when I call it a jihad, so kind of holy war. Okay, and this is also going to be a part of northern Africa that is very, very Muslim influenced. And really, what we're looking at is pretty much the Sudan, Egypt, kind of in through that area, and the Mahdi. Was kind of what they called the guided one, the leader of this revolt, and it really was. It was to try to push back on growing British control of Egypt and that whole area, as they kind of nibble that off from the Ottoman Empire. They fight a series of wars, some of it in Egypt, some of it down in the Sudan, but from 1883 to 1898. But when the dust settles, it's once again, it's the British in control, and the modest revolt violently broken. All right. And then another one I'll give you here, the Asante War. This is kind of a interesting story here. Kind of a later one, right there about the turn of the century. Some people call it the War of the Golden Stool, and that is what you see pictured right here, the Golden Stool. And this was the Asante people were led by a queen. The stool was pretty much almost kind of like this symbol for them of national unity. It kind of represented their sovereignty, their own, their independence, their freedom. And as the British began to again establish more and more of their own control, they demand that the queen hand over this stool, and the response is pretty much up yours, and boom, warfare breaks out. When it's all said and done, again, another example. Well, I mean, you see the words there, failed. They end up losing it all, territory and everything. So obviously you kind of see a relatively sad theme that runs through almost all of these stories that we look at in various parts of the world when it comes to this resistance. And here we are seeing also the impact of the Industrial Revolution, because not only is the Industrial Revolution part of the reason why this is happening, this search for natural resources, but now we're seeing the improved weaponry of the Industrial Revolution. By the time we're in 1900, I mean, I think I mentioned in class, these armies of Europe are now going out with, machine guns, rapid firing artillery, breech loading rifles for their troops. And, they're fighting against indigenous armies that if they have firearms, a lot of times, they're still old muzzle loaders. They typically have no access to any kind of really modern kind of, cannon or artillery. They don't have really anything at all when it comes to machine guns. Are you kidding me? And so, these are very, very one-sided wars that are taking place. And the results, unfortunately for the indigenous people, are not anything too shocking, too surprising. All right. Okay, let's shift gears and let's look a little bit of global economic development. What do we got here? First of all, well, as I was just mentioning, so the relationship between industrialization and imperialism, we can look at it in all kinds of multiple levels, but if we're looking at it just strictly economically, again, it's that need for imperialism to basically to feed the beast of industrialism, to provide the natural resources, that all of that kind of business. So we're gonna look at this in a few different kind of little aspects here. First one, we'll look at technological developments. First of all, railroads are going to play a major role in this new imperialism that's going on during our time period here, and particularly this is really going to blow up in the middle to late 19th century. As far as the use of railroads and imperialism, think about it this way: not very often are they actually being built for the transportation of passengers, although I'm not going to say that doesn't happen at all. Most of the railroads being built are being built in these European colonies, and it is to provide a easier and more efficient way of being able to transport natural resources out of the colony and to the closest port, to get it out to the coast. And so, some of those colonies that are deep in the interior of, say Africa, they're going to be laying down hundreds, in some cases thousands of miles of track to be able to get, whether it's rubber, whatever it may be, timber, whatever, from those colonies out to the West Coast, the East Coast, where there are ports where they can then, the natural resources can be loaded into ships and, back up to Europe they go. Okay. Let's see, what else can we get in here? There we go. Cecil Rhodes, eventually Rhodesia will be an African colony named after him. He is one who is going to, early on, you're just going to ignore the map of India while I'm talking about Africa. India will likewise extensive train network, railroad network that the British will establish in there. I think that's why the picture showed up. But Rhodes, he is going to, he never really completely succeeds. He wants to build a railway system that pretty much is going to link up north, south, east, west. A very, very ambitious guy. And not doing it because, he wants to help out the African people, but he sees the potential, if he builds the railroad and controls it, a way of extracting his own wealth. out of imperialism. He is able to lay down a lot of train track, but never able to quite get the entire Trans-African Railroad built. But it is an example that you kind of tuck in your back pocket of the kind of ambitious planning and labor that is going on by Europeans trying to further exploit those natural resources in Africa. All right. Let's see. Steamships. Steamships will be used extensively in places like Africa and other parts of the world as well. There's parts of Asia, Southeast Asia, where this will come in handy because the steamships, especially smaller ones, are pretty good for traversing. They can navigate up and down rivers, and obviously because they're powered by steam, as long as they got coaling stations, they can go some pretty long distances. And then the introduction of refrigerated ships, late 19th century and going into early 20th century. A big game changer, because now you're going to be able to start transporting perishable goods that before the appearance of refrigerated ships. And a refrigerated ship, quite simply, what it just means is down in the cargo holds, they had basically, they'd already determined and figured out the technology of artificial refrigeration, outside of just throwing in blocks of ice. But literally, using machine-made refrigeration, and so this is kind of the beginnings also at the same time when refrigerators start to be built that will be available in people's private homes. Kind of an early 20th century invention. Kind of expensive to begin with, so not a lot of people owned them, but over time. But it's a technology that is embraced quickly by a lot of shipping lines, because this is going to very quickly open up the range of goods that they can start bringing out of the colonies, because now they don't have to worry about them spoiling while they are en route from wherever that place may be to the markets in Europe and other places. All right, and then also communications technology will be something that will be focused on by the Europeans. The telegraph will be used extensively in India to keep the colony stitched together communication-wise. You also will begin to see in the late part of the 19th century what we call transoceanic cable systems begin to be laid down. And these are big cables that are going to be laid across. I think the first one is across the Atlantic, I believe, but I know they end up laying one across the Atlantic. And dropping these cables that literally, they lie down on the floor of the ocean, but then they are able to use those, at this point, still just more like telegraphic communications. But now you're going to be able to get transcontinental communications going on. And this is important for, imperializers, because it gives them a way of being able to be in quicker contact with their empire. All their far-flung, little outposts here and there in their colonies that are, tens of thousands of miles away, they can keep tabs and they can be in close contact with them. And so, you see, like I said, this is a late 19th century development. By the 1870s, I'd say you see a lot of European colonies now connected together, so to speak, by these communication methods. Okay, and won't see that move over to like radio and those kind of communications until early 20th century. But where we're at right now, telegraph, you betcha. All right. Let's see, I think we got time to probably get one more category in here, and that is just a quick run of what were they making money from. And these are the examples you'll need if you end up writing on one of these topics on the AP test. It's one thing to talk about natural resources, but at some point you got to show what you know and be able to explain what some of those natural resources are. And they're going to get tired of you always referring to rubber. And so you're going to have more in the back pocket there. All right. The big cash crop coming out of India and Egypt, especially, let me talk about it. Cotton. All right. Cotton is a crop that is difficult to grow. It's kind of difficult to harvest and a real persnickety kind of crop. I mean, you got to have the right climate. Yeah, I mean, in the early days, it really is India, and then Egypt will pick up from there, and then sometime after that, they also figure out that the southern North American colonies, what's soon to be the United States, that cotton also is able to be grown there. But when we talk about cotton and imperialism, big time here. And India, we talked about, the British eventually throwing all those tariffs and taxes to kind of block the India cotton industry so it didn't compete with the textiles. But the British still would buy the raw cotton from India. They had no problem there because there was no cotton growing in England. Okay, they didn't want to see India processing that cotton and turning it into textiles themselves. Egypt had and still considered a lot of times to be some of the highest quality cotton in the world. So anyhow, yeah, cotton, good on Egypt, good on India. There we go. All right. Yes, we talked about rubber, and we'll hit it one more time. Like I said, but you got to be able to write about more than that. And most of my mention of rubber has usually been Africa, particularly the Congo in Central Africa, but a whole lot of other places you have to choose from there as well. The French are able to make some money off this in some of their Southeast Asian colonies. The British are able to make money off it in some of their Southeast Asian colonies. Even the Dutch able to get in there. So rubber, which just as the demand for that, especially with the rise of automobiles in the late 19th century, and then really going off in the 20th century, and the vulcanization process for making auto tires. Oh man, I mean, demand monstrous. Okay, so there's that one as well. Palm oil coming from a few different places there. Hold on, sorry, felt a sneeze coming on. Palm oil was actually, you're thinking, so what do you need oil from palm trees? They use the oil to lubricate a lot of the machinery in the factories back in Europe. A lot of these were machinery in those factories that, if they did not stay properly lubricated, would break down all the more so. And the machines not working is money not being made. And so, yeah, that's where that kicks in. And so, yeah, West Africa, you got Malaya out there in Southeast Asia. Again, the Dutch East Indies. So that would be an example that you can mention. Let's see, ivory, which not really needed as a natural resource. That's getting a little bit more into more of kind of a luxury good, but was going to be in high demand sometimes for things such as, you could talk piano keys, billiard balls, because billiards was a very popular game, especially kind of amongst the the bourgeoisie there in the 19th century, and they were made from ivory, which came from the tusks of elephants. Well, all right, the way it was back then. I try not to be too judgy. Let's see, mineral wealth coming from colonies. Well, we've talked about this one before. When Spain still had their colony until about the 1820s, Mexico still continued to be a big silver producer for them. Actually, Mexico still is to this day. You go to Mexico, and that's a place you can find everything from really cheaply made silver to try to get the tourist market, and then really high quality silver for people who know what they're looking for. Copper coming from places as far flung as Chile, also Central Africa, and then Rhodesia, named after Cecil there, a little further south down in Africa. Tin coming from Bolivia, and then in Africa you got Nigeria, and then again Malaya. Very, very valuable colony to the British. Malaya was, because of all the natural resources out there in Southeast Asia. And then gold. Gold was discovered in Australia sometime after the British took control of it and found out that their concept for just a good old penal colony suddenly was like, wait a minute, there's gold here. And they had their own little gold rush, and then gold discovered in South Africa as well, and I don't know so much about Australia. I know that the gold, kind of the gold trade in South Africa still does exist to this day, as do diamonds. The diamond business is still largely centered out of Africa, and Rhodes was active in that. He was a guy that, I mean, man, he had his tentacles all over the place, and he was a interesting character. I don't think anyone I'd really would care to hang out with. He had some pretty kind of, I don't know, for us nowadays, antiquated views about people, but he definitely was a businessman and always looking for an opportunity. And he and some Dutch folks, the De Beers, and the De Beers diamonds still exist to this very day. Um, and the picture you see down there shows indigenous people working the diamond mines. Those of you who've ever heard of blood diamonds, it's a little bit more of a modern term, but it's the idea of diamonds that are obtained either through coerced work and things like that. And nowadays you go buy diamonds and you can ask for it to be inspected. Usually they'll be marked somewhere on that diamond, which you only see through a microscope, but it'll indicate to you whether it is that it is not a blood diamond, that it's a diamond that was mined by someone who was fully compensated for their labor. That probably won't be on the AP test. But anyhow, diamonds, another one of those valuable goods. Okay. All right. I think, yep, we're over 31 minutes, so I'm going to hit the brakes there. And consequences of imperialism probably will be a topic that we can cover a little bit together on Wednesday as we keep the grind going on here, seeing if we can get this unit cranked. I'd really like to see us have it out of the way by the end of this week. So we'll see what happens. All right. Thanks. And we'll see you in the classroom.